Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, every season on the Final Girls podcast, we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism by looking at a particular trope in depth. We are fully into our third season centered on vampires, or as I've been calling them throughout the last 18 episodes, the most elegant and the horniest of movie monsters. In each episode so far, I am joined by a special guest to dive deep into a vampire movie or two, where we discuss the films in detail, try to contextualize them, and think about what works and what doesn't. In today's episode, we're going fully international with a deep dive into two vampire horror films that live in that delightful and delicious gray area between art house and horror cinema. First up, we will be tackling the frankly perfect 2008 Swedish horror Let the Right One In, which tells the story of a bully 12-year-old boy named Oscar who develops a friendship with a vampire child called Eli. Following that, we will discuss Park Chan-wook's 2009 romantic horror film Thirst, which tells the story of a Catholic priest who is turned into a vampire through a medical experiment and struggles to contain both his lust for his friend's wife and his thirst for blood. It's thirsty on many levels. It's a multi-layered thirst film. I'm so sorry. Joining me to discuss both films, and especially the multiple levels of thirst in Park Chan-wook's film, is the brilliant writer and Bloody Woman's commissioning editor Layla Latif to go in depth on all the things that make these two films practically perfect. Before we go into the rest of the episode, I have to give thanks to Arrow Video, who have made this vampire season possible and who bring out the very best in cult horror and genre films, specializing in definitive home entertainment editions with newly commissioned artwork and specially curated extras. Their collection is super huge now with over 500 physical releases, and throughout the season we have been recommending a particular title from their collection that goes with the films that we are discussing. And today's pick is not strictly a horror film, but rather a super stylized and very violent revenge thriller called The Villainess, which actually stars the lead from Thirst, Kim Ok-bin. It is a ton of fun. If you're interested in supporting us, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcast. It genuinely helps a lot. So if you've been enjoying the show, leave us a little review. Really, really appreciate it. And we are also publishing bonus episodes over on our Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/thefinalgirls. And with all of that said, if you are new to the podcast, please know that we discuss the films in detail pretty much from the very beginning. So if you're averse to any discussion of a film before you watch it, consider this your spoiler warning. And if you don't really mind that, then please enjoy our discussion of Let the Right One In and Thirst. Layla, welcome back into the podcast. How have you been?
Yeah, it's a lot at the moment, but pretty good, all things considered.
Yeah, and we are recording this on the day that the Oscar nominations have been announced.
Yes, justice for Delroy Lindo.
Yes.
But some other, nice things that have come out of it. Apparently Judas and the Black Messiah doesn't have a lead. So that was news to me.
Yeah, that was, Sure, that was, there was no leading man in that film where Lakeith Stanfield is clearly the leading man.
Yeah, I just really hope that it doesn't split the vote, because I really want Daniel Kaluuya to win, and if that splits the vote, then we might get Sacha Baron Cohen for the pretty mediocre Trial of Chicago 7.
Well, that is as much as we're going to comment on the Oscars on this episode.
It could be a full episode.
It could be a whole full episode. But
every year I try not to care, and every year I'm like counting down to the announcement and getting really emotionally invested.
Just keep getting sucked back in. We're going to be talking about two wildly different films, wildly different one to another, but I think one of the things that really connects them is the fact that they're not just that they came out around the same time with Let the Right One In 2008 and Thirst in 2009, but also that they fit really nicely in this sort of gray area of horror that I love, that I like to call art house horror, because it seems a little bit more respectful than elevated genre, which is I think is rooted in being really dismissive towards genre.
Yeah.
But
I mean, elevated horror, that is just like the most odious term. And it always comes from people that don't know anything about horror.
yes.
And every year you'll get kind of like, oh my God, look, Ari Aster. He's released the best horror film in like decades. And you're just like, it's not even the best horror film in the... It's very good, but it's not the best horror film in the last 6 months. Like, there is such a steady stream of like incredible subversive work that is always coming out in this field. And it's just so irritating that like there is like cultural amnesia about like
every single year. It's always coming as well from the kind of the mainstream critical establishment, let's call it, as opposed to the genre specific journalists. But these, to bring them back to these two films, it's very rare as well that genre films or horror films specifically sort of break not just through the mainstream critical bodies, but also foreign language films break through into the pop culture mainstream. So not just horrors, but actually kind of art house films with horror sensibilities that are made not in the English language. That breaking through into the mainstream is quite unique and happens very, very rarely. And I think probably Let the Right One In more so than Thirst managed to do that. And it's still increasingly rare, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the thing with Let the Right One In is it's so dialogue light. It's so, like, watching it, I just had so many moments where it was like the subtitles would reappear and I'd be like, oh, wait, yeah, like this film isn't in English, because nobody had spoken for like 15 minutes. And I definitely think there is a thing when it comes to foreign language films of ones that require a little bit less reading, ones that have a lot of like visual mastery, and they kind of do storytelling through like tone and architecture, and they're hitting on all of those bases as well. People can connect with them from a English language audience as well, who's often far too lazy to kind of read the little dialogue at the bottom. But that's not to undermine this film. I think this film is literally perfect.
So on that note, I think that's a perfect time to really dig into Let the Right One In from 2008.
Är du vampyr? Hade du tyckt om mig ändå? Vill du bli ihop med mig?
To start our conversation about this film, do you remember what was your first impression of it when you first saw it, and how has your relationship with the film evolved over the years since it was released?
Yeah, I went to go see it with my aunt, who's not really a horror fan, just before she was getting married, as a kind of weird, like 2 days before the wedding ritual.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it was that thing of like kind of that odious elevated horror thing, where like we're going to go see this well-reviewed horror, and assume her assumption was that then it means it's not going to be particularly violent. So I remember like the kind of tension next to me starting when the man starts pouring acid all over to disfigure his own face, where it's like, oh, I assumed I was just coming to see something that was kind of tonally horror rather than actual like throats being ripped out, which it is. Yeah, but even, it's funny because that still affected my impression of it, because coming back to it years later, I was kind of shocked by like, oh wait, no, this is like very like visceral and like at times ridiculous and quite extreme and like really quite bloody. And like, it's like my memory had slightly, you know, softened it and made it a little bit more moody and more hinting at things. So yeah, I was really glad to reconnect with it. I had completely forgotten about the scene where all of the cats attack that lady.
Yeah, me too.
And like, I was almost like punching the air with joy, being like, yes!
Really? Because I was terrified, because I instantly thought, oh, that is your feature.
Well, you know, as a non-cat owner, it perhaps wasn't so worrying for me, but yeah, no, but it was just, there's some real like camp fun, which I'd forgotten, as well as the kind of like greater sort of cursed, sad landscape that this film takes place in.
So let's talk a little bit about the key characters of this film, because it's so much resting on Oscar and Eli, the vampire of the film, and they're both extremely lonely characters, each in their own way. So what do you think about the way that the film introduces us to them and to the dynamic that builds between them?
Yeah, I love how they're both, quite androgynous, and they have this sort of like yin and yang quality to them in the sort of the white blonde hair and the dark hair, and they're kind of like quite similarly sized, and they do look sort of like they perfectly fit together and sort of enhance one another in that way. But it's just two such great performances from like young adolescents that, quite often are a little self-conscious on screen. I was very impressed, and I think that particularly Lena Leandersson, I'm not assuming that I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, like it's very impressive how she sort of has this like innocence of the child that she's sort of able to project quite seamlessly on screen. But then you do get a sense of like, oh no, this is a being that is hundreds of years old and has like the kind of self-confidence that comes with that. Like one of my favorite moments is actually just a scene where she's with her kind of keeper, and you don't even see her, you just hear her voice, and it's it's the actress is doing that voice, and it has been like played with slightly, but it gets this like great echoey feeling that sort of like somehow in its echoiness makes it feel like it's coming from hundreds of years ago. And like all of that stuff is done kind of layered in so well to feel something that it's not like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing, which I think would be a lot easier to do. I really like this thing that she is sort of in a permanent state of conflict in that sense.
And it also feels incredibly challenging, I guess, to even fathom a horror film that's entirely based and seen through the eyes of two children. And I realized that Eli is not strictly a child, because they're several, well, it's not really established how old they are, is it? It's sort of 12-ish when they were turned. Yeah. So what do you make of this film kind of seen through the prism of children, and the fact that this horrible, really violent story is all entirely being told through the point of view of two children?
Yeah, it is interesting, like how they are like steadfastly children, because I think when you do have that sort of cusp of 12, 13 or whatever it is that they are, that like that's a conflicted time in anyone's life, and you do have this sort of like desire to be older and like sexual ideas coming through, but these two seem very like steadfastly as children. Like there isn't like much kind of sexual chemistry in their dynamic at all, and like in some ways like that's the sort of heartbreaking thing about Oscar, is that like he is, even within his peers, quite childish. I do remember, like, there's one scene where he's trying to lift weights, like to kind of bulk up, which is like one of the like saddest things that I've ever seen on screen. But he is in himself, like, in no rush to be adult and to be adult at all with Ellie. Like, and I suppose that's the sort of sad thing about him, is that the other boys that he is interacting with are sort of forcing him to grow up in a way that he's not really ready for.
Yeah, and I guess that's the saddest, or the most kind of horrifying in real life terms element of the film, is the fact that it's so much a story about a neglected child, and a child that's been hideously bullied by his peers, and finds solace mainly in a vampire and not in anyone around him. Like, the fact that it's a supernatural blood drinking creature, the one that will help him, is kind of incredibly sad. At the heart of this, this vampire horror film, it's a story about a neglected kid who's being bullied.
Yeah, and I think coming back to it, like, especially what's been happening recently, where we've all kind of been talking about as a society how we have to reckon with what we, how we raise our boys, and like how we, what is it that we do that inspires such violence in men. And I think it starts at a very young age. So looking at this now, it did feel like, oh, well, this is like the roots of like male violence and like the terrible things that like young boys and adolescents have to face, their dynamics with their peers. Like, I watched this, and then like in the news I was reading about a 12-year-old boy who was arrested for a stabbing, and like obviously that's a very different thing, and all of these situations are complicated, but I felt like being a girl has sheltered me from so much. I never had any sense, even in like toxic environments that I had as a in school growing up, or like issues, I never felt threatened for my safety. I never felt that I had to like put on muscle and like learn how to like fight someone, or else I might actually be physically harmed in some way. And it's weird to talk about privilege when you're talking about men, but like in a way that is a privilege to have like been sheltered enough that simply by your gender, because I went to an all-girls school, of like never having that like violence in my life. And it's very like normal. I was talking to my husband about it, and he was just like, oh yeah, no, totally. Like, you could kind of keep out of people's way a little bit if you were lucky, but like there's like a threat of like violence when you are a young male adolescent, which is just like beyond fucked up, and it's still happening.
I mean, I wish I could say I had the same experience. Girls can be extremely mean and violent as well in different scenarios. But I think you're right. It's like these two worlds that seem to exist in Oscar's life, and the one at home that he has is like quite cold and neglectful, and nobody really pays that much attention to him, and there's the boys in his school are paying way too much attention to him, and there is no weights that he can lift. There's nothing that he can do once he becomes the target of that bullying. And I think it's that like relentlessness that becomes so heartbreaking to watch, even covered in the supernatural, storytelling. It's still, if you take all of that away, it's an incredibly human story.
And I liked how like the film, in just this like super subtle way, towards, well, I'm sure we'll talk about the swimming pool scene at length at some point, but they just bring in this older brother of his bully, who is an even worse, more violent psychopath. And you're just like, oh, okay, so that's why Jimmy is like that. Because if that's your brother, that is what you become. It's a cycle of abuse continuing.
And I feel like this is a good point maybe to bring in Ellie a bit more and how they're characterized. And it's definitely something that went a bit over my head when I first watched this film when it came out. But as I rewatched it, I noticed it more and more. And it's directly addressed in the text. And I was wondering, what do you think about the way that Ellie, the vampire, is presented? Not just as a vampire, but also as gender-wise, because it's not... I think the film really skirts around how Ellie identifies themselves.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess the whole thing is her being, like, such a young girl. She's able to, like, in just, like, the first scene we see with her under the bridge, she is able to kind of sneak into spaces and make people feel safe and, like, and by kind of projecting herself as being so vulnerable. And people don't suspect, like, the monster that lies within, which, you know, had she been a sort of middle-aged guy, people wouldn't be rushing up to comfort her in the snow. So yeah, I mean, that's a cool juxtaposition. It's not the first time we've seen that, but it is something that's like played to very effectively in this. And, you know, she's got such an extraordinary face, this young actress, that she's able to kind of project a sort of like real soulful sadness with these like giant, beautiful eyes, even in times where, you know, you see her face and she is like splattered in blood. Like, yeah. I really would like to see more of them. I don't know whether I need to kind of do a sort of Scandi deep dive into cinema and hopefully find some more roles that both of them did.
Well, the thing that I found actually really interesting on rewatch is that helplessness as presenting as a little girl is I don't know. Did you notice the fact that Ellie is not actually a girl?
What?
In the film.
Well, I mean, she says that she's not a girl.
Yeah, and I always thought that meant that's because I'm a vampire, right? As opposed to a girl, in the same way that, you know, Twilight says that. But there's a scene, and I haven't read the novel yet. It's been on my list for ages, but I haven't seen it. But in the adaptation, which was done by the author of the novel as well, and then there's a specific shot in the film where Oscar watches Ellie change, and the implication being that Ellie is a boy that was castrated.
What?
Yeah, did you not see it?
Blown. No.
Oh, so this is why
I've seen this film 4 times. What are you talking about?
So there's so in the novel, right? And I say this only having read about the novel. I haven't read it myself. It is explicitly said that Ellie is a boy that was turned vampire and was castrated by another vampire.
Oh wow.
And then in the film,
and then there's the idea that makes you a girl.
Well, there's the idea as well that Ellie is masquerading as a girl because of all of the things that you mentioned, the fact that nobody would suspect them, everybody would trust them. It's a figure to be protected, right? If you find a girl by herself in the middle of an alleyway, you'd go to sort of protect her or comfort her, right? Or you'd be worried. You wouldn't expect the little girl to jump and you know, tear your throat out. But there's actually a shot in the film where we see the scars on the pubic area, and Oscar is watching Ellie change, and it's really quick. And I literally only noticed this time round when I was rewatching the film. I was like, oh, it's in the actual text of the film as well. It's just positioned in a way that it's never really they're not articulated, but it's like there.
Okay, well now I'm for the first time slightly annoyed with how little dialogue there is in that film. Because there could have been one sentence for me to appreciate this whole new amazing layer to this. Like, this is so much more subversive a view of gender than I anticipated. I love it. I wish I just had found this out years ago.
Me too, and I think, you know, to be honest, I'm only in the last few years gaining the language to fully like start to have conversations around all of the implications of gender identity and all of that, and I'm nowhere near being able to articulate a lot of the stuff that kind of much smarter people than I have been talking about. But I find it really amazing and transgressive and not even subtle, kind of hiding in plain sight, the fact that this film in 2008, a horror film about a lonely bullied kid and a vampire and a small child vampire, also playing around with the idea of gender and how Ellie is presenting as a girl and is played by a female actress.
Yeah.
But the gender identity is so much more complicated.
But it's funny also because, I mean, I haven't seen the American remake because I sort of just thought it was like aggressively pointless. But I've seen the trailers and some clips and stuff, but she's they are much less androgynous in the American remake. So that is something clearly that they shied away from as an interpretation, because maybe just too complicated. So, so were we to understand that when Ellie was made into a vampire, the castration must have happened just before. So this was something very intentional in order to facilitate being able to hunt more effectively, because that's the way that people look at girls.
Well,
probably,
without being able to really say in the what happens in the novel, but from the film, I think that would be my theory.
Yeah, because they play into it so much.
Yeah, I think they play into it on purpose, and that line of dialogue where Ellie kind of says, you know, when Oscar is like, "Oh, do you want to be my girlfriend?" which is really cute because they're, you know, little kids, and it's just really, really a really sweet kind of nascent romance that they have. And Ellie is literally saying, "I'm not a girl." But because we think that it's because they're a vampire, that's the only layer. But there's so much more.
Amazing.
It's so amazing, right? It kind of makes it better.
And, like, it's interesting then that, like, the person that Ellie considers to be like a soulmate is actually like a young boy who's being like deeply emasculated by these other kind of brutish boys. God, I'm seeing it all so clearly now.
It kind of now, when I rewatch it, it kind of becomes, as you mentioned before, such an interesting take and exploration and kind of breaking apart of how masculinity is formed and what that means and what the expectations are, especially if we consider the ending. When, you know, I'm jumping way, way, way ahead, but the fact that Oscar becomes the caretaker of Ellie, that's a really nurturing kind of almost not, you know, that's a really nurturing role. And that's something that is consistently drummed out of boys as well, that they're not nurturers.
Yeah. And that and it's funny because like they clearly have like a kind of, they have like such a kind of loving attraction to one another, but we never feel like it is sexual. But I suppose with what's happened to Ellie, like that's kind of not something that they would like really be capable of. So they're looking for a connection on a different level, even though as 100-year-old being, you would assume that'd be something that you would be interested in, much like how in Twilight, he stayed a virgin until he was very, very old, didn't he? Well, we are led to believe. I mean, that is a terrible film. But a similar thing of like the chaste vampire is kind of an interesting idea. And we don't see it very often because like vampires like kind of symbolize like a sort of escape from being like sexually repressed.
And kind of on that note, what do you make of how this film actually uses the figure of the vampire and updates it?
I just think it was like so brilliantly realized as a sort of like tapping into sort of a very like primal rage rather than something like that was like significantly sexual. And like I liked how that was sort of reflected in the journey that Oscar is in. He really reminded me a lot of Adam Sandler in Punch Drunk Love, of like this like mild-mannered, like very like sweet person who is just like being pushed too far, and as a result has this like simmering level of anger being kept just between the surface. And when he does have chance to like express it, you can just see the strength and the joy like pouring out of like every molecule of his body. Like he's never happier in this entire film than after he hits his bully on the side of the head with with a pole and splits his ear open. It's like a really empowering, joyful thing for him to like tap into some anger.
We do have some, I think, examples in pop culture and in cinema of sort of child vampires. I'm thinking especially of Claudia in Interview with the Vampire. But how do you think the vampire that Ellie is sort of uses some of those tropes that we associate with vampires in cinema quite a lot? Like the, not just the sunlight or the way that they hunt, but also the not being able to enter someone's property without being invited first, and a couple of other of those things. Like, what do you make of the way that it uses those very specific vampiric tropes?
Yeah, I was really like struck when I was watching this, where I can't think of another film that did the whole like insatiable hunger of a vampire quite as well as this. Like, you know, there's so much of in the sound design of like, you know, this sort of like mouthy, you know, deep hunger that she's feeling, and kind of even just like the chomping sounds and the sort of like, you know, the groaning of the stomach and stuff. Like, you truly feel that she is going to starve and collapse at any second, even though we, you know, saw her drink someone dry like mere hours beforehand. And like, I thought that was like a really interesting thing, because like with so many vampire films, we do have a sense of it's like, oh no, they must drink in order to live, but you never like see them quite like, well, not never, but you don't normally see them quite so chomping at the bit. You know? Yeah. But I appreciated that. And like, you know, I'm one of those people that like, if I'm on the radio and somebody like eats something whilst they're eating, like I feel like physically ill. So like that really like great sound design, like was very effective to me.
But also the use of silence, right? Because in that scene where Ellie cannot go into Oscar's house, there is no dramatic music in that.
No.
It's just the silence and the witnessing of this bleeding out is really intense because there's nothing else.
It's so horrible, that moment.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's funny because we don't. That's again like with vampires, and I'm thinking mostly of kind of Buffy, but there's like an idea that like, oh, I can't come in. It's like an invisible wall. I can't like I'll bounce off. I can't. But like to see it, it's like, oh no, this is what it will do to me. It's quite like shocking.
And what do you make kind of we've spoken a little bit about our disdain for even the term elevated genre, but yeah, you mentioned at the beginning that you think this film is perfect. Why do you think it succeeds as a horror film, specifically within horror genre?
I think it's just an incredibly like complicated and like well realized like ecosystem of everything, where like everything from within this sort of like cursed cold Scandinavian 80s landscape is just played so beautifully and like with such specificity. Like I feel that like in the choices of like the pop music and in the sort of like, you know, faded jumpers that people are wearing, like you can almost like smell the smells of those rooms. And like minor characters that kind of didn't need to be anything. Like I cannot tell you how much I love Gosta with all of his like many cats and his like lovely patterned knitwear. And I think if you just kind of have a film that has that level of like richness in like areas where it really kind of doesn't have to, but they've just still built it up to be so interesting in just like these tiny, like even the thing with the Ellie's been like, how did I miss that? Because there is so much that is so good in this that like, you know, even like minor details like that, little details can like slip through, and then it's why it's so good to rewatch, because you're picking up on little things all of the time.
And you mentioned the scene in the swimming pool a little bit, but there is quite a lot of gruesomeness in this film, which I think also takes people a little bit by surprise. I don't know if you feel this way, but sometimes I think that people think that American horror films are the most violent or the most graphic horror films.
Which is insane.
It's insane. It's very untrue. And I do wonder if sometimes kind of international horror films, when they are as graphic and use violence and kind of horror very effectively, it almost surprises people.
Yeah, because I mean, it's just the same elevated horror bullshit of like, oh, well, you know, in order to kind of be, you know, a horror film that is, you know, intelligent, you have to be like something like Get Out or The Babadook, and nothing actually like that nasty has to happen. Which is just like very limiting and basic as takes go, and I'm depressed that like I still see it all the time. I still see it in like respected publications couple of times a year. But yeah, but I mean, like the violence in this film, it's like it's not constant, so you never get like deadened to it. Like it's kind of, and it often comes quite suddenly. So I think that's what makes it really, really efficient for me. Like, I love a immolation scene. And this was a very, very good one.
It was a great one. And we haven't even talked about the very odd relationship between Ella and their protector, handler.
Yeah. Well, my assumption is kind of like this is kind of what's happening in this film is something that happened like 40 years previously, where, they connected with like probably someone that was their own age, and then they became the handler, and then that's also the fate that's going to happen to Oscar is they're going to kind of be in that role and eventually be traded in for a younger model.
I think the same. I think that's the way that I read it, is that Ella is constantly refreshing their connections and the people that will protect them.
Yeah, the curse of immortal life. It's going to happen to Wonder Woman too.
And especially considering that it's a child vampire, so it's a vampire trapped in a child's body. They're never going to be able to be as self-sufficient as an adult.
No, it's funny that, like, in a way that, like, the sort of curse is that you're going to go from, like, a sort of loving peer and a romantic relationship into someone's just going to age into being your parent. Like, I mean, what could be worse?
And I wanted to talk specifically about the swimming pool scene.
Oh my god, this is one of my favorite scenes in all of horror. And I have, I did refuse to watch the American remake. I have watched the American version of the swimming pool scene, and I can say that it is good, but worse.
It's one of your favorite scenes, so...
Oh my god, I love it.
Why do you love it so much? Kind of what works about it so much for you?
Well, I think there's so many things that are kind of happening simultaneously. Like, I love the creepy pop music that's happening in the way. Also, already on the back foot, because the way that Oscar keeps his mouth open whilst he swims is truly disgusting.
Okay.
And then I love how they introduce this, like, terrible older brother, which just kind of, like, ties into the super depressing relationship that this is all coming from. And then the sound design, again, of the way they filter the sound through the water is just done so beautifully. And some of it, like, having watched it so many times, doesn't really make sense. Because, like, how is he able to continue holding his head down after he's been decapitated? Wouldn't you let go? But it's so perfectly realized that they just... it's just such confidence as a filmmaker to be like, no, we're literally not going to look above the water. And then this like phenomenal detail that I really liked and I'd forgotten was that there's one child survives. And when we do finally get above the water, the fact that it's like then punctuated by just like a sobbing child on the bench having just witnessed all of his friends being literally torn into pieces just adds this like really like cursed melancholy to it all. And then the beautiful connection of then Oscar and Ellie's eyes just meeting and the few spatters of blood. I think it's just gorgeous. There's literally nothing about it I would change. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful scene. I love it. Love it.
And what did you make of the ending?
Well, I was very glad that Gosta survived. I was very nervous for him at several moments. But yeah, it was just kind of like, I think it's that thing that a lot of films do very well, of like just that kind of Chekhov's gun of we're just going to bring something back from earlier on to tie this back. So like the little Morse code on the box I thought was a lovely moment to leave it on.
And we sort of briefly talked a little bit about it before, but this was one of those films that really broke through into the mainstream, and it got, I think, almost universal critical acclaim, and people were doing the thing that we kind of complain about a little bit of, this is the film to resurrect horror, or this is the best modern vampire film ever, I think Roger Ebert said in his review. But why do you think it struck such a chord at that time? And I know it's like a complicated question because it's been a long time, and also our big cultural relationship with horror has changed quite a lot, but it still seems one of those films that is almost untouchable.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it was actually kind of at the time where vampires were everywhere back in 2009. So it's almost like it came along as like a gritty remake of like the sort of teen vampires that we were seeing. But that kind of does it a disservice, don't you think? Like, I think it kind of should just be appreciated for what it is, and it's not just looking at the vampire myth. I think it's like doing what all of the best horror does, where we're talking about like a terrible societal ill and like political and existential issues, and we're just exploring it through this myth. So, I mean, I will struggle to find something negative to say about Let the Right One In.
Oh, I'm not going to say anything negative about it, because I think it's a gorgeous film. I think it would be a gorgeous film if it was not using horror, but obviously it taps into my particular interests really, really well. But I do find it really fascinating how this film, and you know, even as two people who really love it and who really love and appreciate horror in all its forms, can still kind of find new meanings and new layers to it years onwards. I'm amazed at a film that feels as transgressive as this one in some ways. But it does exactly that, you know, like sometimes people think that idea of socially minded horror films was invented with Get Out, but the best kind of horror is always talking about something deeper, and usually using genre as a way to articulate things that are much more complicated and much more difficult perhaps to present very directly.
Well, now with you coming to, you know, towards the end of this vampire season, what is it that you feel that's like distinct about this? I know you always complain I turn things around on you, but I'm always just so interested in your thoughts. Like, what do you feel that's like unique about Let the Right One In?
I never complain about it. I just find it really funny because you always do it. I was like, when is it going to happen? When is she going to turn it around and be? I'm going to be put on the spot. Do you know what looking back now, having rewatched it now, I think it's the ideas about gender. And you know, I'm not going to pretend to have been smarter than I was at the time when I first watched it. I didn't get it at that time. When I was revisiting it this time, I started noticing, and I think because we're thinking a lot about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to move in the world, what it means to put yourself in danger, what it means to feel safe as well.
Yeah.
And having been watching very, very different types of vampire films, I think a lot about how, you know, it's a very romantic and very horny type of character when it's in an adult male form. And Let the Right One In is so subversive because it challenges our ideas of vampires, because like Ellie is really scary. They can jump on you and tear your throat out. Like the actual violence, the bloodletting in this film is really grounded. It's very practical. You know, the whole thing of them just sort of draining their victims in a way that is as efficient as possible is kind of very serial killery, right? And the idea that they're kind of using this construction, kind of using people's assumptions of what's safe and who's safe against them, is also really scary, because that kind of denotes to me a really intense understanding of rules in society that we're only just now unpacking.
Yeah.
On a larger pop culture scale, I mean. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, no, it is interesting that, like, in many ways, we never actually see the full extent of what Ellie is capable of, because the swimming pool scene where she rips 3 people to pieces in the space of maybe 45 seconds, like, takes place entirely off screen, and we only see, like, the slightest hints of it. Like, clearly there's something that she sort of functional, I think, mostly in the way that she tries to kill people, but you don't really get a sense of, like, that there's, like, a great joy for her in, like, killing people and, like, drinking her blood. It's, like, a wholly necessary act. But, like, that moment where she's having to defend Oscar, she kind of taps into, like, a desire to hurt. Which is why she's so savage.
Super savage. And I know that you already mentioned that you didn't watch the remake, but the remake kind of came really, really quickly after this one. And
yeah, but, like, everything about it was slightly annoying to me. Like, even the fact that they called it Let Me In, which I'm like, you've literally taken a really good name and made it slightly worse. And I feel that that's going to be thematically what's going to be happening in this entire film. But I did, you know, the swimming pool scene of the American one is on YouTube, so you can just check that out if you just kind of want to do a side-by-side. And you can just see everything is just slightly less stylish and slightly less specific. Like, it's just like a blandening, which, I mean, to be fair, it's not okay of me to judge it based on, like, the one scene that in the trailer that I've seen. But yeah, no to remakes. Just, you know, this film has got, like, all of 16 minutes of dialogue in it. Like, the idea that, like, oh no, American audiences couldn't handle this film that is for the most part silent. Well, very annoying.
I was going to ask you, kind of, rather than about the specific remake of Let the Right One In, like, what do you make in general of the idea of this sort of running to do an American, usually American, but that would be unfair to just generalize. But yeah, okay, an English language remake of an incredibly successful foreign language horror.
Yeah, it just came up again recently with Train to Busan, where it's like, oh, so you're going to literally take a film that has perfected the visual medium of storytelling and remake it. Why? Oh, yeah, it's just kind of sad, and it's lazy, and, like, so much of, you know, the most exciting things that come out of horror is, well, out of all genres, people doing something new and experimental. So, I mean, I know it's, like, the most boring take in the world to be like, I don't want there to be more remakes, but truly, they need to stop.
Well, before we move on to Thirst, is there anything that we haven't talked about Let the Right One In that you wanted to mention?
I've covered my love of Ghost. No, I think we're good.
We've covered my fear of cats. That's great. Yeah. So on that note, let's move on to talking about Park Chan-wook's Thirst from 2009.
Time of death, 3:31 p.m.
뱀파이어는 어떻게 해서 되는 거예요?
우리 둘 다 지옥 가요.
사람 살리는 일을 하고 싶어요. 이렇게 자꾸 보내기만 하자니 괴로워 죽겠습니다. 아무도 저를 위해 기도하지 못하게 하시고.
So, with this film, same question. When did you first come to it, and have you revisited it since then?
Yeah, I came to it after I had watched the Vengeance trilogy. I think it was kind of post, like, An Old Boy is still one of my favorite films. And yeah, so it was more just kind of a deep dive more into his catalogue. I'm not sure when that was. Maybe 8 years ago or something like that. But I mean, I would go so far as to say that Park Chan-wook is like top 3 of my favorite directors. Like, I adore his work, and I just think he's someone that can like cross into so many different genres so effortlessly. I could write books about how much I love the film The Handmaiden.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, to be fair, bringing it back to Let the Right One In, Thomas Alfredson is not bad at that either. Like, I mean, these are 2 films from like non-genre directors. Well, at least like that aren't just genre directors. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm not I'm not saying only, you know, that that's a bad thing. But it is interesting that both of them were able to like turn their hand to genre in a way that in a way that was so effective. I do like a lot of his other kind of horror, forays into horror. Have you ever seen the short cut that he did?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, I love 3 Extremes. It's great. But yeah, his entry is particularly effective for me.
So I guess that's a perfect way to ask you my next question. So where do you think this film sits within the work of Park Chan-wook?
God, yeah, he's sort of him firing on all cylinders, isn't it? Because he's so good at romance, and he's so good at sort of like making things extremely visceral. And then he's also so good at just layering in like the darkest of humor into everything that he does. Not to kind of like just talk about how much I love him. I do particularly love the way that all of his films are edited. Like, there's such like an amazing pace to like the way things are done. And from what I understand from just a quick Google is that he doesn't edit his own films, but he has a collaborator called King Sang-bum who has edited everything that he's ever done. And like, that is just the most beautiful collaboration in my view of like, I mean, like, the editing in his film is just like a true art form in itself. And like, the kind of joke with editing is just like, oh, well, you kind of shouldn't like notice the cuts, but in this one you really do. And there's another like level of the storytelling.
Oh, 100% agreed. I wanted to dive a little bit into... It's funny you mentioned that he does romance really well. And I think he does eroticism much better than a lot of people give him credit for. Yeah. And the Handmaiden is kind of testament to that.
There's a funny thing with The Handmaiden, because I love The Handmaiden, but I have met so many terrible dudes who love The Handmaiden. So I almost like I don't want to like bring up my love of The Handmaiden, because that is so often like led to me having like the worst conversation in a bar with a guy who like doesn't get it at all and just thinks of it as like sexy lady film.
Yeah, I mean, just remove yourself from those conversations immediately. But
I feel safe here. I don't think you're going to do that to me.
No, not at all. You know, I'm trying to work up a season where I can actually talk about The Handmaiden. But to bring it back to Thirst, what do you make of our central love affair? I mean, one of the ways that this film connects with Let the Right One In is that the center at the heart of it, amongst all of the many layers of both of these films, is a love story between 2 very lonely people.
A very sexy love story at that. Like, I remember talking to you once about Trouble Every Day, and you were telling me about how like people were getting horned up at a screening of that. Yeah. And I was like, who the heck? That I could not have had less of a reaction like that. Like, I could have not been less turned on. And then this film, I was like, you know what? I'm really into this sexually. Like, I am just like fully horned up on the Song Kang-ho and King Ok-bin train. Like, even at the times where they have truly some of the most upsetting sex scenes, I was like, I'm still into it. Like, they're having a 3-way with a corpse, into it.
But cannot deal with Vincent Gallo even for a millisecond on screen.
No, he's a real boner killer for me.
Yeah. So let's go in a little bit into Sang-Huynh in particular, who's the protagonist, and is, I think, such a lovely, earnest vampire.
Yeah, I mean, and I love this idea of like somebody that's like deeply, deeply and sincerely religious and spiritual, just being so depressed and essentially being suicidal. But the only way that they can sort of commit suicide, essentially, is by signing themselves up to, like, dangerous medical experimentation, because that's still ultimately, like, an altruistic act.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, I really like, one of the things I love about anything that takes place in a monastery is it just gives everything like a really like ahistorical kind of vibe.
Mm-hmm.
Like monasteries seem to like exist in like no particular place in history. So it's already sort of making it feel much more kind of surreal and epic at the same time. Does that make sense?
Kind of, because I think I get that sense from any films that deal with very intense, with characters who have very intense faiths and very sort of sincere but also troubled relationship with their faith. I think it's something it's so fertile for cinema, but also very, very difficult to get right.
Yeah. And they go really like medieval monk flagellating in this one, which is, you know, I think something that could seem over the top, or well, I mean, actually, so much of this film over the top, but seem like insincere. But like, he's such a, I mean, he's one of the world's greatest actors, Song Kang-ho.
100%.
So like the fact that he can just like pull off this incredibly like conflicted person so well, both in like human and in monster form, just wonderful. Chef's kiss.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the fact that it seemed extreme to you, because, like, I mean, I grew up in Spain, which is mostly Catholic, so that, like, self-flagellating aspects of it did not strike me as extreme at all.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh. I assumed that was just kind of something from a kind of bygone era when everybody was, like, far less, you know, more into, like, the idea of, like, sexuality as being extremely sinful, but no, still? Oh.
Still, I mean, you know, not every Catholic, I wouldn't go around saying that, not at all, but I think the profundity of his faith and also the idea of flesh seems really interesting in here. And he even says it at one point in the film, his character, where he's wrestling with the guilt not just of his own faith and his own desires, but the fact that his desires are now amplified by the fact that he's a vampire. And like, what do you think it actually how do you think the film explores the idea of faith and desires? And those desires can come in the form of like food, lust, desire for connection.
No, it's true. The lust is almost stronger than the bloodlust. I mean, he's almost seems to have more control over his bloodlust than he does for his like lust for Taeju. And, like, I did love this, like, extra element that they bring in of, like, to the vampiric curse of, like, that if he sort of, if he doesn't drink blood, he, like, succumbs to, like, a painful plague. Yes. Will kill him. It was just, like, another way for us to have, like, wonderful, like, visual storytelling. Like, the fact that, like, oh, he doesn't drink blood. It's not that he looks kind of pale and drawn. He's just becomes covered in, like, oozing pustules. I really might watch this film straight after this again because I love it so much.
And let's talk a little bit about Taejun, because I find her so fascinating as a counterpoint to him. There's a real, this might be a little bit, I can't help but think of Interview with a Vampire. There's a real sort of Louis reluctant vampire, Lestat really want to kill and fuck everyone now that I'm a vampire vibe going on between the both of them.
Yeah, but then I suppose a lot of that comes down to, like, power, like the power that they've experienced in their lives beforehand, that, like, fundamentally for all that Sang-hyun has, like, been trapped within, like, the constraints of his religion. He fundamentally is there because he's made a series of choices that he wants to be a priest, and this is, like, but with Taeju, you know, she grew up in this like horrifically abusive household. She's treated so awfully by someone, so it makes more sense to me that she is someone that is going to like gleefully embrace power and freedom and her sexuality and being able to do all these things for her first time, because she's really been, you know, enslaved in many ways by like her, you know, things out of her control being born into the situation that she was.
And what do you think about the way that their relationship kind of blossoms when they first start off illicitly, and then as the film progresses.
Do you want me to talk you through the sex scenes? Is that what you're asking me?
I mean, you brought it down into the gutter, Layla. I was like, what do you think about their love and the way that they're orphans and connect with one another? And you're like, but do you want to talk about the way that they bang and spit blood into each other's mouths? Go on. I will hear.
I just think there is such a beautiful visual metaphor
sure
of a man loving a woman so much that he will lick her calloused toes that are blistered from a hard day's work and the abuse that she suffers. What is more beautiful as an expression of love than that? And if then they bang, or more power to them. But no, I was really moved by that scene where he's kind of licking her feet. I thought it was beautiful, and I like the idea of, like, we're so used to kind of seeing women, even like when we have like women in films that are like supposedly coming from like difficult positions in life, that like as soon as they undress, they're sort of like so pristine and like have none of the like scars of what living that existence would be like. But I was like, yes, of course her feet are like yellow and like calloused, but he loves her and he's deeply attracted to her.
The chemistry between the two actors is amazing. And it's also this sort of desperate longing that underpins their sexual attraction to each other. Like she calls herself like almost a virgin, and he's definitely a virgin. So it's not just the fact that it's sort of a forbidden attraction, it's the fact that they probably haven't really experienced that level of connection with anyone else. And the fact that Tae-jun's husband is, oh Jesus Christ, like the grossest human being alive.
He really is. But yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm quite impressed with that level of like physical comedy that he does. That's not easy. Because actually, if you look at that man, that is a handsome man, like, who is really just selling us that like he is sexually undesirable, and like disgustingly sexually undesirable.
Yeah,
but guys, something about the dripping nose at all times that I think it would, is kind of a hard sell, because but he pulls it off.
It's between that and the farting in the kitchen and having his mom smell it and determine that he needs some more medicine. It's like,
it's not great.
This is a very, very big boner killer for me and for Tae-jun, clearly. But
yeah, but it's funny because they are so like, there's this sort of weird thing where with the sort of abusive behavior that both her mother-in-law and her son have towards her, where it is a little bit played for laughs. Like, we don't go as like dark into it as we could, but there's still a sense that like when that man is dead, that is a good thing. Like, even when we find out, because she claims that he's abusive towards her, and he is. He's just not like beating the crap out of her, but she lies to Sang-hee, and says, Sang-hee, and says that he was, and then it turns out that was a lie. But I just feel that like it's not really, like, it's in a way like it's just because you're not able to particularly articulate the exact nature of your abuse doesn't mean that he wasn't abusing you, and he, well, maybe not deserved to be murdered, but he deserved to be gone. She deserved to be free from him.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up, because that's how complicated the moral dynamic is in this film, and the fact that Sang-hyun actually has a very quite like black and white approach to morality. Because I think this is what makes him so interesting as a vampire figure as well, is because he's got this thing of, I won't kill people. He drinks blood from a comatose patient. Like, he doesn't force anyone. He doesn't attack people, really. He doesn't want to murder people. And he murders her husband for her because he thinks that he's morally allowed to kill this man because he was abusive towards her. But he doesn't actually give the space. You're right, she doesn't really articulate it in a particularly like complicated way, because she also is like manipulative in a way that I find really interesting. But Sang Hyun also doesn't see, even though he sees it, he literally is there. He doesn't accept the fact that he does deserve to be gone. Like, the husband does deserve to be gone, even though he wasn't, physically abusing her.
Yeah, it was just another added layer of horror of this film. Like, the amount of cruelty that, like, people are allowed to have towards young women without anyone saying anything.
On that note, kind of, what do you think about the way that their relationship changes once they're both vampires?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, clearly it's, she's something of she's far more monstrous and far less kind of confined, and I think she sort of sees herself as being like this like alpha being now. Like, human life doesn't really matter so long as it like serves her. And it's interesting that like there's a suggestion, like, because Sang Hyun is not really changed that much as a character when he got this virus and became a vampire. That the suggestion is that sort of how she's felt the whole way. Like, it's not that there's been a massive change in her character. It's just that now she has like the opportunity to be monstrous that she is. But it kind of makes sense to me that like, oh, if you live in like this society where you are treated like dirt by everyone and told that you don't matter, that like then when you get a little bit of power, you feel that way too.
No, I totally agree. Like, it seems so freeing for her. Whether it's for him, it's like this burden.
But I think she was like a nihilist the whole time.
At that point, well, actually, two things. What do you think about the actual mechanics of being and becoming a vampire in this film?
Yeah, so it's kind of convention. It's like a virus, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, there's some phenomenal stuff with the older priest that desperately wants to become a vampire as well, so he can regain his sight, and that like Sang Hyun finds that so abhorrent and disgusting. But like the idea that you can only like, he seems to only believe that you can kind of take on eternal life if you really want, if it's a burden to you. The idea that like anybody might actually do this to do something like see again, which I think is kind of a reasonable thing to want, is abhorrent to him. And I wonder whether that kind of buys into that kind of flagellating idea of Catholicism of like everything must be like be so tied to like suffering and giving everything up and like not having any joy.
I think it kind of does, to be honest. I think you've really articulated there. And in the same way, there's that moment of selfishness from Sang Hyun's point of view when he Taejin is killed, and then he sort of transforms her kind of after she's gone, which I think is totally filmed like a sex scene. What do you think?
Yeah. Again, turned on.
Listen, I'm with you with that scene. I was like, this is there is a lot of stuff going on here.
But it's sad because like it's fundamentally like it kind of comes at this like last minute choice that he has of like, oh, I really want, maybe I don't want to be alone, and this is someone that would be happy for me to turn them. But it's like, why didn't you think that from minute one? Like, what is it about like this sort of, and maybe it's the reason that he became a priest. Like, he's so into like denying himself joy. Like, yeah, which is devastating. But like, Song Kang-ho's face, I was just like watching this film and I was like, this man has just got muscles or something in his face that nobody else in the world has, because he like is just able to do things genuinely. There's times where he is almost unrecognizable because of just like a certain thing that he's expressing. It's almost like he doesn't have a face. We literally just have like a portal into feeling and thought.
I love that. A portal into feeling and thought. Fuck, that's beautiful, Layla.
Thank you.
But I had
put it on the poster.
I had a thought. Bear with me here, but have you ever done a bar class?
Oh, like the exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know how it's like you don't really move that much, but it somehow hurts more than any other exercise class that you could ever do.
And you're like, I only moved my foot. Why does my my whole torso hurt?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of in a much less elegant way to continue on from your point about Song Kang-ho is that his performances kind of feel like a bar class where it seems like nothing is really happening on his face. Like, what are you doing? What's happening? I don't understand. Why is this so amazing and so effective? And by the end of the film, he's just broken you into a million little pieces and you don't quite know what exactly did he do or how he's done it. And then you see him in a completely different film in a radically different role and he's done it all over again and you can't move and your whole body hurts. And your soul hurts.
Yeah, but he's a faceless portal bar glass of a man, and we love it.
We do. I don't get it. I'd be really scared to meet him. He seems like such a fun person as well. I was like, there's too many emotions going on here, and now you can also fly.
If any editors are listening, commission Anna and I to write an extended long read on this man's face.
Just a deep dive bar class style analysis of the muscles in his face and everything.
I literally might pitch that to someone. I might pitch an article to someone of like top 10 things that Song Kang-ho's face has done.
And kind of on that note, once there seems to be a really distinct tonal shift in the last third of the film, I'd say, once they're both vampires. What do you make of it?
Like it's so incredible, like when you're looking back of like everything that just happens in the final act. Like there's so many things that, I mean, maybe not iconic on a broader, but me personally, iconic scenes within this of like that incredible rooftop fight that they have, which is like, I literally just got off watching 4 hours of the Snyder cut and they spent $70 million and none of it is anywhere close to this scene on the rooftops of like, they actually have, there's a sense of like power and like weight and like and the mechanics of it kind of work. And I think that was so beautifully done. But then the scene where the catatonic mother is trying to tell her friends that these two people murdered her sons, I think it's like some of the most hilarious physical dark comedy I've seen in a very long time. Like, it's so funny. And like, and it's kind of, it's one of those things where it's so dark that like, is it, you almost are like, am I okay to find this as funny as I do? But, I mean, they know that it's funny. You're not kind of like, you know, it sort of only becomes apparent after a few minutes when you have that amazing bit where Taeju, like, picks up the chair with the mother-in-law in it and then forgets that she's not supposed to have superhuman strength and so has to just gently put her down. Like, it's absolutely hilarious. And then the wonderful white hallway, 80s music video horror scene. Wonderful. Wonderful.
And when does it all kind of start breaking down? Like this wonderful extreme existence that they're both leading. When do you feel it starts kind of crumbling around them?
I think it's probably, I mean, it's sort of doomed from minute one, isn't it? Because fundamentally, Sang-hyun is never going to be happy as a vampire. And he's never going to really be prepared to leave this sort of monstrous creation that, well, he thinks she's monstrous, on the planet to like kill people. He feels responsible for that. And so there's kind of only one way that it could go. But I was really struck watching it now for the first time because Sang-hyun decides that in order to kind of get rid of the mythology around him, that he is like this wonderful healer, an incredible person, is that he's going to make it look like he tried to rape a woman in a campsite, and then that will sort of demystify everyone about him, and which is like so sadly would not work. Like when people are like deified men, like the idea that like a single attempted sexual assault would like ruin your reputation really like struck me as being like, oh, that's really sad that probably wouldn't do anything.
Oh, that
and
is
like within like in reality, like people be like, yeah, she probably deserved it.
Oh, Jesus, that's...
I know, but isn't that sad?
That's really sad, and sadly very accurate.
Sorry, I've been slightly affected by recent events.
Yeah. No, that's completely understandable, and also, just a good point.
Sorry.
No, it's a good point. It's kind of, I think, within the spirit of the film, I think it kind of taps into a certain naivete that he has about people. The character has about people and how they perceive him. But to start kind of wrapping up our conversation about it, how do you think the film works as a vampire film? How do you think it kind of uses and also updates or just approaches differently our ideas of vampires on screen?
Yeah, I think it's a very like classic vampire tale in many respects, and like I believe it's based on a Victorian novel, which doesn't actually have vampires. It's more about infidelity.
Yeah, Thérèse Raquin.
Sorry, I have also not read that. I haven't read Let the Right Way In. I have not read that either.
Well, it is not a book podcast.
True. And so it is kind of like there's something about it that feels extremely timeless to me. Mm-hmm. I think it's more kind of like looking at that through like the wonderful mind of Park Chan-wook. Mm-hmm. Like, so it's, so whilst maybe it doesn't have so much to say about like vampires that is that unique, it's more just kind of like putting that wonderful filter of his perspective on everything, which I think you could literally have him make any genre of film, and he's just got such a beautiful way of framing everything, of like putting kind of like really like complicated themes of like shifting tones all the time that are just gonna elevate it to an incredible level.
And even though this film picked up, I think it was the Best Director Award at Cannes Film Festival.
Yeah.
I want to say, no, sorry, I think it was the jury prize. It was the jury prize, yeah. Which, again, still, I know we have this conversation every fucking year, but I am still amazed at how still it seems an exception it is every time a genre film, a horror film, sort of gets recognition from the mainstream prestige bodies of the film industry. And I wanted to ask you kind of entirely entirely subjectively, like, why do you think this film perhaps is not as well known or doesn't come up as often amongst the films of Park Chan-wook, or even kind of those art house horror films that Let the Right One In fits in as well perfectly? Why do you think this film maybe has not crept into the mainstream horror mind as much as others have?
I honestly can't see why, because it's like so fun and so gorgeous, and like it's, Song Kang-ho is like a very well-known global actor, so It makes very little sense to me. My only thing is that maybe it's just so rare that something does break through that like maybe it's more that it's remarkable that Let the Right One did rather than like saying anything about Thirst that it didn't. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Like, did you have like a big sense of this like being a film at the time that it came out? Like, I didn't grow up in like Europe so much, so I'm often like have very inaccurate takes on what actually was a popular film.
Well, we'll never call your takes inaccurate. I think I'm trying to think back, and I think I was similarly to you aware of it because of Park Chan-wook. Because I was sort of discovering him around that time. And I remember watching, I hadn't rewatched this film in a long time, but I'm thinking now, and it's like, even now, even after Parasite broke through in such a big way, and even after Song Kang-ho and Park Chan-wook as a filmmaker became massive global successes, I think this is probably the film of his that people talk about, one of the few of his that people talk about the least. I remember probably the first film of his that I saw was I'm a Cyborg, But That's Okay, which is another one of these kind of really weird, romantic, sci-fi-ish
So good.
films, which is amazing. And it's also one of the ones that people don't really talk about that much. And I'm just looking at the poster of it now, which is in this incredible shot of Taejin kind of upside down grabbing onto the neck of a Seo
Very sexy.
So sexy and so just, eye-catching. And he's wearing his Catholic priest collar. It's like all of this is just screaming this film needs to be massive. And I don't know. I think perhaps the length. It is over 2 hours long.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it kind of doesn't scream that it's as funny and as violent in a really funny but also provocative way as it is.
Yeah. Do you think looking at that poster, someone could think that it would be like a very dry film about kind of sexual desire and priesthood? That maybe like nobody even gets it on, they just want to. Maybe. I mean, it's hard to kind of put yourself into like a kind of tabula rasa state because like I came to this film knowing the director and knowing, and kind of, well, not knowing what to expect necessarily, but like knowing that like quality was assured.
Yeah, same. But, and then really to wrap it up, kind of where do you think both of these films, now with the benefit of hindsight, what do you think they have done for vampire films in general?
I would say that Let the Right One In has probably had more of an impact. Kind of stylistically across kind of not just vampires, but like horror generally. And like that kind of reigniting of like the creepy kid that you then tended to we've seen a lot of in the past 10 years or so since it came out. Yeah, but I guess because in some ways Thirst is more conventional in everything but its execution, so I don't know that it has like that great the like legacy of influence that came afterwards. I wish it did. I want more films to end with like whales jumping through blood.
With vampires burning themselves alive, with a paralyzed old lady watching them.
Yes, these are a few of my favorite things. I want all of those.
And also ghost threesomes, I guess.
Yeah. And like literally I want kind of sickly ghosts to come in and like just kind of insert themselves into three-ways, and I want way more Song Kang-ho full frontal nudity. Like, so.
Well, it's not called Thirst for nothing, is it?
Yeah, brought out the thirsty hoe in me.
Layla Latif, an intellectual. Layla, before we wrap up, is there anything about Thirst that you wanted to mention that we haven't covered already?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just like, I hope that it just kind of communicated like just how much this is a film that if you like Park Chan-wook or you like vampires, you like, just excess on screen. Like, things don't have to be, so restrained in order to be like credibly art house. Things can just be like maximalistic at all times, and it's great when it's in like someone as skilled as him.
It's an amazing way to end. And Layla, thank you as always for your time and for your insight in both of these films, and for all the Song Kang-ho thirsting. Not sure why I was not expecting that. It makes complete sense.
Yeah, this is very much my wheelhouse.
And where can people find more of your work online?
Follow me on Twitter at laylalatif.com. I'm just about to start a column with Curzon, which is exciting. But I am constantly on Little White Lies. I'm at Total Film. I'm with BBC Culture. I'm with Freeze. I crop up all over the shop. But yes, also, if you want to write for Bloody Women, email me, please, layla@thefinalgirls.co.uk. If you have any great pictures, any thoughts, no matter how obscure, actually, the more obscure, the better, let's try and come up with something together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's it for this episode of the Final Girls podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. If you can, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and you can find out more about what we do over on thefinalghost.co.uk. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter over there and follow us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at The Final Girls UK. If you can, please head over to patreon.com/thefinalgirls, where we post bonus episodes and more goodies, and we really appreciate your support. You can also find Layla at Layla_Latif, and I am on Twitter at Anna B. Demented. Thank you, as always, for listening. And next week, we continue with the Vampires of the Naughties with a deep dive into Byzantium and Only Lovers Left Alive.